The outbreak of the Great War paused some domestic troubles in Europe, but it didn't stop them. As you've learned, the European powers utilized their colonial resources to fight and expand the war effort, thus making this truly a global war. However, some colonies took advantage of the focus elsewhere to further their own efforts toward independence. But first, some backstory. During much of the medieval period, Ireland was independent, divided up into a multitude of kingdoms. Like other European states, Ireland was affected by Viking expansion in the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries, but not enough to destabilize their political system. In the 12th century, one of the Irish kings invited the Normans, who conquered England about a century prior, to come and help him defeat a rival king. The Anglo-Norman king who did this, Henry II, then took full control of the expedition and persuaded many of the minor Irish kings to accept him as their overlord in 1175. The popes encouraged this political agreement because they wanted to exert their influence over the Irish Catholic Church, which had, in the opinion of Rome, too much detachment from Western Christendom. The Anglo-Normans then established English-style feudalism in Ireland. Irish nobles who worked with or intermarried with the Anglo-Normans flourished, while subsistence farmers were enserfed and most native Irish were oppressed. However, the hostilities of the Hundred Years' War saw increasing English neglect of Ireland, and Irish lords, still ostensibly under English control, gained back authority over Ireland. This situation persisted, semi-autocracy, until the 16th century, when Henry VIII reasserted English control over the whole of Ireland. Henry even used the title King of Ireland in his correspondence. Then, in the 17th century, Oliver Cromwell purposely moved to incorporate Ireland more fully into the then English Puritan Republic. He fought Irish Catholics, confiscated their lands, and encouraged English and Scottish Protestants to emigrate to Ireland, most of them settled in the northern parts. This violence continued during the Glorious Revolution. The mostly Catholic Irish supported the Catholic King James II. William of Orange fought pro-James forces in Ireland and defeated them. Then he confiscated lands from Irish Catholic landowners and redistributed those lands among Irish, English, and Scottish Protestants. Those Irish Catholics who were able to keep their lands did so with Protestant trustees to act as overseers. So, since the late 17th century, the Irish had existed in very much a colonial state. An attempt by Irish, both Catholics and Protestants, to break away from English rule in the late 18th century resulted in the 1801 Act of Union, which created the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. In the aftermath, the English looked at Ireland as an agricultural producer. The English did not invest in industrial development in Ireland. Thus, the potato blight of the 1840s hit Ireland particularly hard, not only because it eliminated an important source of food, but because it decimated one of Ireland's main exports. Perhaps inevitably, the 19th century saw the rise of more organized Irish nationalism, initially mostly among Irish Catholics. First, Irish Catholics began to run for political office. In 1828, Catholic Daniel O'Connell was elected as a member of Parliament, but due to anti-Catholic laws passed in the aftermath of the Glorious Revolution, he could not be sworn in. O'Connell spearheaded the repeal of the anti-Catholic laws, cheered the passage of Catholic emancipation in 1829, and then served as a reform-minded MP for Ireland until his death in 1847. By the end of the 19th century, Irish MPs had begun to advocate for measures which would eventually grant Ireland independence. Charles Stuart Parnell, who served as an MP from 1875 to 1891, was the leader of the Home Rule League, a political party founded in 1873 with the goal of gaining home rule or self-governance for Ireland. The League dissolved in 1883 and was replaced by the Irish Parliamentary Party, which was equally focused on attaining home rule for Ireland. The British Parliament introduced an Irish Home Rule Bill 3 times. The first bill in 1886 was defeated in the Commons. The second bill in 1893 passed the Commons but was vetoed by the Lords. Then came the third bill in 1912. As you'll hopefully recall from an earlier lesson, the House of Lords veto was removed in 1911 as part of the wrangling for David Lloyd George's financial People's Bill. So, when the Third Irish Home Rule Bill was introduced in 1912, it sparked the Home Rule crisis in Ireland. While such self-governing bills had strong support among Irish nationalists, most of those nationalists were Irish Catholics. Northern Irish, who lived in Ulster and who tended to be Protestant, did not want Home Rule because they feared it would lead to complete independence from the UK, which, to be fair, the Irish nationalists did want. In response to the introduction of the Third Home Rule Bill, Ulster Protestants organized the Ulster Volunteers, a paramilitary group who vowed to use, quote, all means which may be found necessary to defeat the present conspiracy to set up a Home Rule Parliament in Ireland. Some Irish nationalists were willing to compromise, and they amended the Home Rule Bill to exclude Ulster from Home Rule, but this didn't stop the Irish Unionists from their preparations. It also somewhat split the Irish nationalist group, as one faction insisted that Ireland should not be partitioned. So, those Irish nationalists formed their own paramilitary group, the Irish Volunteers, in 1913. Both the Ulster and Irish Volunteers began to recruit men and prepare for war, importing weapons and artillery from abroad, mostly from Germany because, by this point, Germany had a pointed interest in destabilizing the UK. While the Third Home Rule Bill would, in fact, pass into law, it never was enacted, at least not right away. The British Parliament issued a Suspensory Act in 1914 when the Great War broke out, and this paused any sort of movement towards its enactment. The Suspensory Act ensured that recently passed laws could not immediately be enacted, but would rather be suspended for the duration of the conflict. Since, initially, all combatants assumed the war would be a short one, this Suspensory Act didn't, at first, seem particularly alarming. However, as the war effort dragged on, Irish nationalists grew impatient for enactment of the Home Rule Bill. With the outbreak of the Great War, many of the members of both the Ulster and Irish Volunteers had joined the war effort and were off fighting in Europe. Still, the desire for Home Rule was present, and a secret nationalist fraternity, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, began planning an uprising against the British. Their uprising, which is known as the Easter Rising, took place in April of 1916. It began on April 24th, the Monday after Easter Sunday, and continued for 6 days. The British Army responded by sending in heavily armed soldiers who brutally suppressed the rebellion. Thousands of Irish were arrested, and the leaders of the Easter Rising were executed. The response to the Easter Rising was brutal. Irish civilians discussed British war crimes and demanded a judicial response, but none was forthcoming. Parliament's willingness to seemingly sweep such actions under the rug triggered more forceful calls for Irish independence. A new political party called Sinn Féin was founded. The Gaelic words translate to ourselves alone in English, and they were a continual reminder of the fight for Irish independence. In the 1918 elections for the British Parliament, Irish voters selected a majority of MPs from the Sinn Féin party. These MPs refused to recognize the British Parliament as the governing body for Ireland and instead established their own assembly in 1919. This first Dáil, which ratified the Declaration of Irish Independence that had been published during the Easter Rising, thus formally announced the foundation of an Irish Republic. In September of 1919, the British outlawed both the Dáil and Sinn Féin, which prompted the Irish War for Independence. The Irish Republic used the reorganized Irish Volunteers, now known as the Irish Republican Party, as their military. The British augmented their Irish police force, known as the Royal Irish Constabulary, the RIC, with a group of special reserves, made up mostly of British veterans of the Great War, whose mismatched uniforms — they wore their military khaki pants but RIC dark green shirts — gave them the nickname the Black and Tans. The Black and Tans gained a reputation for cruelty toward Irish civilians and their property, as they were entirely undisciplined. The British Parliament, scrambling to address the issue of the Irish and hoping to stop this war, which had erupted at the end of the Great War and during a global pandemic, passed the Government of Ireland Act in November 1920, and it was implemented in early 1921. This act divided Ireland into two districts: Northern Ireland, a mostly Protestant area, and Southern Ireland, a Catholic district. each area had its own capital and its own parliament. Both districts also sent MPs to the British Parliament. Northern Ireland remained in union with the UK, while Southern Ireland became a crown colony. They had a governor called a Lord Lieutenant who was appointed by the British monarch, but this allowed them some attempt at autonomy. This act, though, was seen as too little too late, and so the fighting continued until July of 1921, when a number of things allowed for a truce. First, news of the behavior of the Black and Tans reached Britain, and both the public and the monarchy reacted with horror and a willingness to stop the fighting. Also, despite a much larger British force of around 100,000 men, the IRA, numbering about 70,000 but really only using a tiny number, around 3,000 men, to fight a guerrilla war, could not be stopped militarily. Lastly, the violence in Belfast, Northern Ireland's capital, which had targeted Catholic civilians, was also horrifying to the British public. And so, they were willing to sue for peace. In December of 1921, the Anglo-Irish Treaty was ratified in triplicate by the Dáil, i.e. approved by the Irish Republic, by Southern Ireland's House of Commons, i.e. approved by the Crown Colony's legislature, and by both houses of the British Parliament. In January of 1922, as per the terms of the treaty, the British Parliament created the Irish Free State, a dominion within the British Commonwealth. Dominion status meant that Southern Ireland was now an autonomous state within the British Empire. The first Dáil was dissolved, while a new bicameral Dáil was created. An appointed Governor-General had control of the Irish Free State, but he was aided in his work by an Irish Executive Council. Northern Ireland chose to remain a part of the UK, a choice outlined in the Anglo-Irish Treaty. Problems emerged again, however, when the British Parliament insisted that Irish representatives swear an oath of loyalty to the King. Irish TDs, Dáil representatives, who opposed the terms of the Anglo-Irish Treaty refused to swear this oath, and so were not seated in the new Dáil. This anti-treaty group, as it turns out, were the majority of the TDs, and so it was the pro-treaty group, a minority in the Dáil, which actually governed the Irish Free State. These tensions between Unionists and Republicans eventually split the Irish military, still called the Irish Republican Army, into the pro-treaty regulars and the anti-treaty irregulars. This situation, essentially governance by the minority, could not continue, and the tensions erupted into a new war, the Irish Civil War. The anti-treaty party, the Republicans, were led by Eamon de Valera, who'd been a member of the First Dáil and a former president of the short-lived Irish Republic. This party objected most to the fact that the state would remain part of the British Commonwealth, and that TDs would have to swear an oath of fidelity to King George V and his successors. Pro-treaty forces were led by Michael Collins, who'd also been a member of the First Dáil and who'd represented Ireland during the Anglo-Irish treaty negotiations. They argued that the treaty gave, quote, not the ultimate freedom that all nations aspire and develop, but the freedom to achieve it, and so they felt it should be honored. Collins and his commanders were able to build up the Irish Regular Army, which was also known as the National Army, thanks in large measure to British supplies of artillery, aircraft, machine guns, and ammunition. In contrast, at the start of the Civil War, the Irish Irregular Army, who took on the original name of the Irish Republican Army, was without an effective command structure and couldn't accumulate weaponry as easily as pro-treaty forces could. The Irish Regular Army overwhelmed IRA forces on the battlefield, and they were able to capture multiple IRA leaders, forcing first a ceasefire and then negotiations to end the war. So, the Irish Civil War ended with pro-treaty victory, thus continuing the Irish Free State. However, since pro-treaty leader Michael Collins was assassinated during the war, it is de Valera who becomes the face of this new Ireland. In the aftermath of the Irish Civil War, new elections saw the Unionists, the pro-treaty party, win 40% of the seats in the Dáil, while Sinn Féin won only 27%. Of course, at the time of the election, many Republicans who'd fought in the war were still imprisoned and unable to vote. Just because the Republicans had lost a war did not mean that they'd given up on their dream of Irish independence.